The freight train rattled westward through the cotton fields of Texas in the summer of 1943, carrying cargo that shouldn't have existed on American soil. Inside the cramped wooden carriages, 240 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their Afrika Korps uniforms still stained with North African sand. They had been told America was weak, decadent, a mongrel nation incapable of discipline. They had been told they would face humiliation, perhaps execution. What they found instead would shatter everything they believed. At Camp Swift, near Austin, the train doors opened to reveal something the propaganda had never prepared them for. Standing in formation on the platform were American soldiers, black American soldiers. The Germans stared, some with visible confusion, others with barely concealed contempt. One prisoner, Wilhelm Hartmann, a corporal from Hamburg, muttered to his companion in German, "They send their slaves to guard us?" The misconception that would haunt his captivity had already begun. But this story isn't what you think. It's not about violence or brutality forcing proud Nazi soldiers into submission. The historical record reveals something both more subtle and more devastating. What happened at Camp Swift and dozens of other facilities across America wasn't a story of black sergeants beating Germans into line. It was the story of a paradox so profound, so deeply hypocritical, that it would help ignite the modern civil rights movement and fundamentally change America itself. Because the shocking truth was this: those German prisoners, sworn enemies of democracy, received better treatment, better facilities, and more freedom than the black American soldiers guarding them. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States operated the largest prisoner of war camp system on Allied soil. By May of 1945, 425,871 prisoners lived behind American barbed wire. 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, 3,915 Japanese, 700 facilities total, spread across 46 of 48 states. The camps concentrated in the South and Southwest, where mild climates minimized heating costs, and vast agricultural regions faced desperate labor shortages. Texas alone held 90,000 prisoners, more than any other state. Oklahoma operated compounds at Fort Reno, Fort Sill, Camp Gruber, and Camp Alva. Mississippi's Camp Clinton housed admirals and generals in individual bungalows with private gardens. The prisoners began arriving after the May 1943 surrender of Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa. Over 150,000 German soldiers were transported that year alone. From 1943 to 1944, an average of 20,000 to 30,000 prisoners arrived monthly via Liberty ships. Following the June 1944 Normandy invasion, arrivals increased to 30,000 per month, reaching a peak of 60,000 in the war's final months. These weren't concentration camps. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States was required to provide living quarters comparable to American military standards, the same food rations as American soldiers, and payment for labor. German prisoners received 80 cents per day for work, equivalent to an American private's pay. They ate the same meals as combat soldiers, including beer, cigarettes, and wine for general officers. They received special Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts. They could purchase items at camp canteens. Many prisoners found their conditions better than civilian life in Germany. One stated, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American prisoner of war, I weighed 185. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes." But here's what the Geneva Convention also protected: German prisoners from public ridicule and humiliation. And that single provision would create the most bitter irony in American military history. The U.S. military's initial policy was explicit. Black soldiers were banned from serving as military police escort guards for prisoners of war. The official justification revealed the twisted logic of racial segregation. Black prison guards would invite enemy reprisals because international law banned the humiliation of captured enemy personnel. Read that again. The United States military deemed it humiliating for white enemy combatants to be guarded by black Americans, but not humiliating for black American soldiers to be treated as second-class citizens in their own military. At Camp Swift, Staff Sergeant Leon Bass, a black soldier from Philadelphia, watched German prisoners walk freely through areas he couldn't enter. The base exchange cafeteria had a whites-only section where Germans could sit and eat. Bass and his fellow black soldiers could not. Bass later recalled, "We were American soldiers, in uniform, who had sworn to defend this country, and yet the enemy had more rights than we did." The segregated escort guard system wasn't disbanded until April 1944, though black soldiers had already been guarding prisoners in North Africa and Europe before that date. The camps themselves were commanded by American officers, but German officers and NCOs maintained internal discipline among prisoners. Guards mostly supervised rather than directly controlled them. Germans woke their own men, marched to meals, prepared for work details. At Camp Reynolds, Pennsylvania, Private Bert Barbero documented latrine segregation in February 1944, a section of the latrine for Negro soldiers, the other being used by the German prisoners and the white soldiers, thereby placing the tyrant over the liberator. Only 300 black nurses served in the entire Army Nurse Corps as of 1944, compared to 40,000 white nurses. Many black nurses were specifically reassigned to prisoner-of-war camps after authorities discovered too much fraternization between white nurses and German prisoners. This was considered a second-rate assignment, and black nurses were prohibited from treating white American service members even as they cared for enemy prisoners. But the breaking point wasn't physical confrontation. It was something simpler, more devastating. It was a cup of coffee. April 1944. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, an electrician in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, was traveling by train from Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, with 8 other black soldiers. During a layover in a small Louisiana town, they tried to purchase coffee. Jim Crow laws meant no lunchroom would serve them. The only place that agreed was the railroad station lunchroom, but they had to drink it in the kitchen. Then, at 11:30 in the morning, approximately 24 German prisoners of war arrived with 2 American guards. Trimmingham stood outside and watched. The prisoners entered the lunchroom. They sat at tables. They had their meals served. They talked, they smoked, they laughed. They had quite a swell time, as Trimmingham later wrote. He watched from outside, through the window, as enemy soldiers enjoyed privileges denied to him, as men who had killed American soldiers ate food he couldn't purchase, as prisoners of war exercised freedoms an American service member could not. On April 28, 1944, Trimmingham wrote to Yank, the Army Weekly, "I stood on the outside, looking on, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die if need be for this country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on?" The letter was published, and America had to confront what it had created. Trimmingham received 287 letters in response. 183 came from white service members, mostly from the Deep South, expressing support. His letter inspired a fictionalized short story in The New Yorker, theatrical plays, and became a pivotal document cited in President Truman's decision to desegregate the military. Trimmingham himself stated he had been very religious until the incident. His faith in American justice had shattered over a cup of coffee. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. The Germans noticed Wilhelm Hartmann, the corporal from Hamburg who had sneered at his black guards upon arrival, spent 6 months picking cotton alongside black laborers in Texas. He watched them work twice as hard as the prisoners, for half the pay. He saw them denied access to water fountains he could use. He witnessed them called boy by overseers who addressed him as sir. In a letter smuggled home and later recovered by historians, Hartman wrote, "The Americans lecture us about democracy while treating their own people worse than we are treated. The blacks work like animals. We are guests by comparison. I do not understand this country." German prisoners arriving in America were often shocked by segregation. They saw segregated bathrooms at train stations. They watched black train attendants call them sir and serve them. They discovered they received better treatment than black American soldiers. They could access whites-only facilities that American service members could not. One German prisoner of war observed, "The blacks didn't do much better than us. They were just in front of the wire, and we were behind the wire." A German farmer, working alongside black Americans in Louisiana, noted the exploitation with disturbing clarity. "You have to see how they lived. These people were so exploited." He observed that African Americans were expected to pick 2 to 3 times more cotton than prisoners were required to pick. The historical irony was suffocating. Nazi Germany had built its ideology on racial hierarchy, on the supposed superiority of the Aryan race, on the systematic persecution of anyone deemed inferior. Hitler himself had written in Mein Kampf about the contamination of the white race by Negro blood. The Nazis had forcibly sterilized an estimated 500 Afro-Germans. They had banned jazz as Negro music. They had placed black people at the bottom of the racial scale of non-Aryans, along with Jews, Slavs, and Romani people. And yet, imprisoned in America, these same Germans witnessed a system that often mirrored their own racial hierarchy. Germans at Texas prisoner of war camps commented they were being taught the meaning of democracy, while outside the southern camps, no black citizen dared to step on the sidewalk alongside white Americans. The Nazis used American white supremacy as propaganda, just as the Soviet Union would during the Cold War. The sheer hypocrisy was staggering, given that Nazi race policies were often inspired by American Jim Crow laws and racial segregation models in the first place. So where does the myth come from? The story of black sergeants physically confronting Nazi prisoners, beating them into submission, forcing compliance through violence? It doesn't exist in the historical record. Matthias Reis, the preeminent scholar on German prisoners of war and African Americans during World War II, found surprisingly little conflict between the two groups in his authoritative 2013 study. Instead of antagonism, German prisoners and black soldiers developed unusually harmonious relationships, remarkably free of conflict. Both groups worked side by side, performing unskilled and unpleasant low-paid labor, cotton picking, peanut harvesting, pulpwood logging. Both recognized each other as prisoners, slaves like us, united in their shared marginalization. Only one major violent incident occurred, the Fort Lawton riot, on August 14, 1944, in Seattle, Washington. But this involved Italian prisoners, not Germans, and was a riot by frustrated black soldiers against preferential treatment of prisoners, not enforcement of military discipline. 43 black soldiers faced court-martial in the largest and longest Army court-martial of World War II. All convictions were overturned in 2007 after investigation revealed prosecutorial misconduct. Only one documented case exists of German prisoners refusing to obey a black soldier. Private Joseph in Utah was placed in charge of a work detail when German prisoners refused to work for him because of his race. The white officer's response? Colored boys are not allowed to detail or work prisoners of war. No disciplinary action was taken against the prisoners. No physical confrontation occurred. The breaking wasn't physical. It was psychological. It was moral. It was the slow, grinding realization that the world they had been taught to believe in was built on lies. Black soldiers didn't need to beat Germans into submission because the reality was doing that work for them. every meal the prisoners ate, every privilege they enjoyed, every whites-only facility they accessed while black American soldiers could not. Each one was a hammer blow against Nazi ideology and American hypocrisy simultaneously. The Pittsburgh Courier launched the Double V campaign in February 1942. The first V for victory over enemies from without. The second V for victory over enemies from within. Victory abroad against fascism. Victory at home against racism. Black soldiers' letters documenting these experiences were published in Yank magazine and black newspapers across America. The Pittsburgh Courier's circulation reached nearly 200,000 by 1942. The Chicago Defender distributed 250,000 copies weekly, with pass-around readership exceeding 1 million, using Pullman porters for national distribution. The black press extensively documented every incident, every letter, every photograph, showing the disparity. They provided front-page coverage of black military achievements. They gave extensive space to the Double V campaign with drawings, articles, and photographs. The mainstream white press largely ignored it. When covered at all, stories were buried or minimized. But the truth was spreading, soldier to soldier, letter to letter, community to community. At Camp Gordon Johnston, in the Florida Panhandle, black servicemen reported being assigned to dispose of the human waste of the whole camp, including that of German prisoners. Another Florida-based soldier reported black men were constantly guarded by armed guards, even for minor offenses, while the Nazis arrogantly walk around this field free and scoff at us. Private Harold Hardy wrote to the NAACP in 1944, "It was tragic that the Germans could laugh at columns of our troops, walking separately from the white soldiers. I know what is in their Aryan minds. Ha ha, they're saying, the black Yank is only good as a workhorse." At Mississippi camps, at least 2 facilities provided white latrines and water fountains to German prisoners while segregating black soldiers to inferior facilities. At Fort Papago Park, Arizona, a German prisoner declared he hated a racial slur in front of a black Army nurse. The commanding officer refused to punish him. Charles Dryden, a Tuskegee Airman and decorated combat pilot, recalled visiting a base in South Carolina where German prisoners could enter the white side of the post-exchange cafeteria, while he and fellow black officers, heroes who had distinguished themselves in aerial combat, could not. Historian John Hope Franklin described being on a segregated train where scores of black soldiers were packed into a coach section, while German prisoners sat in a more spacious compartment with white guards. This was the funniest thing. They were laughing and looking up there at us, standing on top of each other practically. The question Corporal Trimmingham asked echoed through an entire generation. What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing? President Franklin Roosevelt maintained military segregation throughout the war, despite pressure from black leaders. He issued Executive Order 8802 on June 25, 1941, banning discriminatory employment practices in defense industries, but only after Philip Randolph threatened to bring 10, 20, 50,000 Negroes on the White House lawn. Roosevelt imposed racial quotas limiting black military population to 9%. The vast majority of black soldiers were never sent overseas. Most were relegated to support roles, not combat. Roosevelt made little effort to end segregation because he needed Southern Democratic votes in Congress. He met with black leaders in September 1942, demanding full integration, but did nothing to implement his promise. It was a political calculation. Roosevelt was personally supportive of black civil rights, but made it a political calculation rather than a priority. After Roosevelt's death, President Harry Truman was moved to act by violence against returning black veterans. My stomach turned over when I learned that Negro soldiers, just back from overseas, were being dumped out of army trucks in Mississippi and beaten. Whatever my inclinations as a native of Missouri might have been, as president I know this is bad. I shall fight to end evils like this. In 1946, Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights in response to lynchings of black veterans. The committee's 1947 report to secure these rights condemned all forms of segregation and demanded immediate end to discrimination in armed services. On July 26, 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating racial integration of armed forces. There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Truman took enormous political risks. Conservative Southern Democrats walked out of the 1948 Democratic National Convention. He risked losing the white Southern vote in the general election. When Secretary of Army Kenneth Royal stated, "The Army is not an instrument for social evolution," Truman forced Royal into retirement for refusing to comply. The paradox of German prisoners living better than American soldiers had become impossible to sustain. Approximately one-third of civil rights movement leaders in the 1950s and 60s were World War II veterans. Medgar Evers organized voter registration drives in Mississippi in 1946, armed groups threatening him at every turn. He was murdered in 1963. Whitney Young became first sergeant in 3 weeks after enlisting in 1942, later becoming executive director of the National Urban League in 1961. Ralph Abernathy, a Korean War veteran, co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King Jr. Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd assessed, "They had a great impact on the movement. I would go as far to say, if it wasn't for the black soldiers who came back from World War II and the Korean War and lent their expertise to the cause, Dr. King and the other ministers would not have been able to effectively organize the masses as they did." NAACP membership grew from 50,000 in 1940 to 450,000 in 1946, a tenfold increase directly related to war experiences. This war chest enabled legal challenges and organizing that would culminate in victories like Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Historian Leon Litwack called 1946 the true birth of the civil rights movement, due to widespread violence against returning black soldiers. The Congress of Racial Equality conducted first sit-ins to challenge Jim Crow. The Journey of Reconciliation in 1947, the first Freedom Rides, challenged segregation on interstate buses. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball in 1947. Historian John McManus explained, "Blacks had just helped destroy some of the most homicidal, racist regimes in human history, and yet they had served in an armed force that was segregated on the basis of race. They were victimized by the same sort of racist views that had animated America's enemies. This made zero sense, and it created a powerful moral imperative for domestic change." He continued, "World War II led to an explosion of racial reform, issues that the Civil War failed to solve and that had been festering for nearly a century. In my opinion, World War II was the most significant event in American history, to a great extent because of the racial change it helped foster." So, what actually broke the German prisoners? What shattered their Nazi ideology, if not violence from black guards? It was witness. It was contradiction. It was the slow accumulation of evidence that everything they'd been taught was lies. Wilhelm Hartmann, the corporal from Hamburg who sneered at his black guards, spent 2 years in Camp Swift. He picked cotton. He ate better than he ever had in Germany. He watched black Americans work harder for less. He saw the abundance of American agriculture, the endless fields, the machines that harvested more in an hour than German farms produced in seasons. In a diary, recovered decades later, he wrote near the end of his captivity, "I came here believing we were the master race. I leave knowing we were the fools. The Americans have everything. The blacks have nothing, and yet they serve. Who then is the slave? I think perhaps we were, all along." Not all prisoners experienced this awakening. Many returned to Germany still clutching Nazi beliefs. But enough changed. Enough questioned. Enough saw the contradiction between propaganda and reality to plant seeds of doubt, and for Black American soldiers, the breaking was different. It wasn't their ideology that shattered. It was their patience, their willingness to accept second-class citizenship, their faith that America would eventually live up to its promises without being forced. Over 1.2 million African Americans served during World War II. They didn't all come home as activists, but they all came home changed. They had tasted life without Jim Crow in Europe, where Ebony magazine stated Black service members enjoyed more friendship and equality in Berlin than in Birmingham or on Broadway. They had watched enemy prisoners receive treatment denied to them. They had stood outside lunchrooms while Germans ate inside. They had been told guarding white prisoners would humiliate the enemy, but experienced daily humiliation themselves. They had fought fascism abroad, only to return to American fascism at home. Vermel Jackson's husband returned from the Pacific Theater, only to have two white men stand outside a bank, preventing him from depositing his service check, saying they'd keep Black veterans in their place, lest their service convince them they deserved civil rights. Isaac Woodard was still in uniform when a South Carolina police chief beat him so severely he was permanently blinded. These experiences forged a generation determined to finish the fight at home. So, why does the myth persist? Why do people believe Black sergeants beat Nazi prisoners into submission? Because we want simple narratives. We want clear victories. We want to imagine justice delivered with a fist to a Nazi jaw, righteous violence correcting historical wrongs. But the real story is more complex, more painful, more honest. The real confrontation wasn't between Black sergeants and Nazi prisoners. It was between the ideal of American democracy and the reality of American racism. Between the promises in the Declaration of Independence and the practices in Southern lunchrooms. Between the four freedoms Roosevelt proclaimed to the world and the single freedom Black Americans were denied, to be treated as human beings. And in that confrontation, violence wasn't necessary. The hypocrisy was so stark, so undeniable, so photographed and documented and written about in letters home, that it could not be sustained. Corporal Trimmingham's question didn't need violence to be answered. It needed to be asked, published, read by 287 people who wrote letters of support, shared in the Black press, documented in soldiers' testimonies, placed on President Truman's desk as he made the decision that would begin the end of military segregation. The 860 German prisoners buried in 43 U.S. sites remain as monuments to this strange chapter. Approximately 5,000 Germans emigrated to America after repatriation. But the lasting legacy isn't in those numbers. It's in the one-third of civil rights leaders who were World War II veterans, in the NAACP membership that grew tenfold during the war, in the 1946 wave of activism that birthed the modern civil rights movement, in the moral imperative that couldn't be ignored, a hypocrisy so profound it helped dismantle Jim Crow and advance the long struggle for equality. The real breaking happened slowly, one letter at a time, one published photograph at a time, one returning veteran at a time who said, "Never again," not with fists, with truth. And truth, in the end, proved more powerful than any beating could ever be.